that. Here we go.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here to talk to you guys today. I'm going to pull up my presentation here. That's not it. At the end of my presentation, at the end of our time, I've got two standards that we have pulled. We were giving away some of these standards basically so we don't have to fly them back. So I have two that we've pulled business cards, two to go to specific people, and I've also got about 5 copies of NFPA 654 to give away that we don't want to take home, okay? So they're right up here. Anyway, I'm going to talk today about our combustible dust standards. I'm going to give you an overview of where we stand with combustible dust, where NFPA stands with combustible dust project. Let me make sure I can, there we are. I'm going to go over the standards, our standards making process, and how you can participate in that. I'm going to, again, give an overview of combustible dust and our explosion protection standards. I'm going to go over 652, which is our new standard on the fundamentals of combustible dust. I'm going to give you an outline of 652 and 61. 61 is the ag dust document, and then I'll close up and have some questions. Okay. NFPA stands for the National Fire Protection Association. We have a lot of acronyms. We have a lot of numbers. It's always good to know what your acronyms stand for. Again, National Fire Protection Association. We are located in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is the town just south of Boston. We've been around since 1896. We started out writing boiler standards. So again, we've been doing this a long time now. We are a not-for-profit. We're not a government agency. I've had people ask me, oh, you're going to work for the government. No, I'm not. I've been at NFPA about 4 years. Again, we're an independent agency. Membership organization, we have about 60,000 members. So if you're a member of NFPA, thank you for supporting us. Members in 118 nations. For the most part, our standards are used in the U.S., but we do have more and more of an international presence. We just sent a delegation to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is looking at, not Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and they're looking at using our standards, as well as I just got an inquiry last week from Singapore. They're looking at developing standards that look like our industrial medical gas standard, NFPA 55. So that's one of our priorities as an organization, to have more of an international recognition and more of an international presence. Okay, this is our mission and our vision. We are the leading global advocate for the elimination of death, injury, property, and economic loss due to fire, electrical, and related hazards. We write the National Electric Code, which is adopted in all 50 states. Okay. We are a standards development organization, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a voluntary standards development organization. We're adopted. Our codes and standards become law when they're adopted through fire codes. So there'll be a state or a local jurisdiction will adopt a fire code. There are adopted fire codes in all 50 states. Mostly the NFPA 1 codes, which will adopt the combustible dust standards directly, are mostly in New England. Most states are IFC code states. But those states, through the IFC, also adopts by reference combustible dust standards. The issue is it's very specific. It's state by state. It's jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It's very difficult for us to know which standards are adopted in which states and which editions of which standards are adopted. For example, Massachusetts just adopted NFPA 1 in the last year or so. They just adopted the 2012 edition. The 2015 edition has already come out. So the NFPA 1 that Massachusetts has adopted is some of our older standards. As an example, up until they adopted NFPA 1, I used to get questions because Massachusetts had adopted a 1992 version of one of our standards. So again, it all depends on what state you're in, and what edition of the code is adopted. Our standards, NFPA staff does not write the standards. Our standards are written by technical committees. I've got 2 members of 61 here today, Anthony and Jess. I don't see anybody else here that's on the committees. Our process is open. Anyone can attend a committee meeting. Anybody can make a public input or public comment to one of our processes, one of our codes and standards. So if you see something, if there's something in a document that you think needs to be changed, you can submit a public input or public comment to change that. The only person who can't do that is NFPA staff, so which sometimes can be a little frustrating, but we are impartial facilitators of the process. Okay. All of our documents are available to be read for free. There's a free access on nfpa.org. You'll go to nfpa.org, codes and standards, click on whichever standard you want to look at, and you can read it for free. You can't print it, you can't search it, but they're all accessible online. Okay. This is what the document information page looks like. This is an older version of one for 652, the fundamental standard. But again, you'll look at the next edition standard if you want to look at what's going on in the process, what's coming up next. Okay. Oh, and if you want to, if you're interested in the how a standard is moving through the process and you want to know when there's something new, you can sign up to get email updates, and you'll get an email when something changes. When we've posted minutes, we've posted a new version, when public input's available for review. Okay, this is the list of our dust standards, the industry or commodity specific standards. Again, NFPA 61 is the agricultural and food processing. We also have a combustible metal standard. 654 is more of a general standard. It's meant to be chemicals and pharmaceuticals. It's evolved over the years into something that's more of a general industry standard. We have a sulfur standard. It doesn't get a lot of use, doesn't get a lot of interest, but we still have it. It's important to people in that industry. And we have a wood standard as well. Okay. The dust documents, combustible dust has been around for a long time. The NFPA standards haven't been around quite as long as combustible dust, but actually the ag dust standard dates till the 20s. 654 dates till it came about in the 40s. So with all these different committees, there's about 100 individuals on all these committees. Some of them, there's a lot of overlap in terms of staff. As time evolved, the requirements became different in all the standards. So about in 2010, 2011, about 5-6 years ago, we set up the dust project to have a correlating committee. The purpose of the correlating committee is to have consistency between the dust documents. So we've been working together on that since then, and this is how the project is structured. Okay. 652 came out last year. The fundamentals document, the new one, came out last September. It's the first draft meeting is next week. It's already in standard. It's already in. It's back in cycle. It's on a 3-year cycle. It's already back for its next edition. The 61, the ag dust, 654 and 664 were just issued in the last couple months. They're all available now on nfpa.org. I've got the new 61 is here. I've got a copy of that to give away to somebody. So those have all come back out. 61 is going back into a 3.5-year cycle, so that will start up again. It'll be open for public input pretty much right away. So again, we've sped up the process a little bit in trying to get the documents to correlate and basically have the same requirements or close to the same requirements in all the documents. Okay. Just talked a little bit about OSHA. Right now, there is no OSHA dust standard. OSHA proposed a rule in October of 2009. There's a national emphasis program on combustible dust. We met with OSHA about a month and a half ago, and their plan is to have small business hearings on the combustible dust regulation in October. They do not plan to issue anything this term, which means that any rulemaking on combustible dust will be up to the next administration. So, and again, it's hard to say what's going to happen with that. Okay, so all of our standards, all of our dust standards have 3 fundamental principles. One is that to control the fuel. what you want to do is limit the accumulation or formation of a dust. Sometimes that's hard if the dust is your product. But you want to limit the formation of it. You want to limit and keep it inside the equipment. The next thing is that to control the ignition sources, and again, this is outlined in all of the standards. Identify potential ignition sources and keep the ignition sources away from the dust. And if you do have an ignition, to limit the spread of a combustion event. And what the dust standards do is point you to the explosion protection standards. We won't tell you how to protect your equipment against an explosion, but we'll send you to the standards that do and tell you when you need to go look at the explosion protection standards. Okay. Where do you find combustible dust? Dust collectors, equipment where dust collectors, grinders, hammer mills, blenders, silos, transfer points, rail car unloading. These are examples of places where dust is generated. Okay. I think everyone here has probably seen the explosion pentagon here for dust. Let me see, there we are. Okay, so you start off with fuel. You need an oxidant in most cases. In almost all cases, the oxidant is air. And ignition. So these are the three elements that, 3 of the 5 elements in the pentagon are the same as a fire triangle. What you need for a dust explosion is you need a mechanism to disperse the dust. And then you need confinement here. And then you can have a dust explosion. Okay. 652 is the fundamentals document. Again, this document was put together by a new committee, started in 2010, 2011. The scope is to provide the basic principles and requirements for identifying and managing fire and explosion hazards of combustible dust and particulate solids. So this is the document that will contain the fundamental requirements, and all of the industry and commodity-specific documents will be implemented through this process. It will direct the user to those standards, for example, 61, for industry-specific requirements. Okay. The outline here in terms of chapters 1, 2, 3 are always the same in all of our documents. Chapter 1 is the scope, Chapter 2 is references, Chapter 3 is definitions, and this is how the document's laid out. Okay, it applies. This is the application. What I tell people is that it's important to know in any NFPA document, always start with the scope. Always start with Chapter 1. Know what it applies to. Know if it applies to your industry, your operation, your facility. And again, you need to go to Chapter 1 to do that. Equally important is to know what it doesn't apply to. The new version of NFPA 61, there's a table in the back that lists properties of combustible dust, of common combustible dust. One of our committee members from FM Global, they pulled together, working with some industry representatives, a lot of representative data for combustible dust. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. One of the new dusts on the list is fudge brownie mix, which was my favorite combustible dust. It's not particularly combustible, but it is combustible and it's on the list. So storage or use of consumer quantities. Example, if you have combustible, if you have fudge brownie mix in your pantry, you're not subject to 652. If you're a supermarket selling fudge brownie mix, you're not subject to 652. So again, you need to look at what it applies to and what it doesn't. Okay. One of the important provisions in 652 and the commodity specific is the conflict provisions. And we spent a lot of time in all of the committee meetings going through this. And the way the conflict provisions work is that if the requirement in the industry or commodity specific standard differs from 652, the industry or commodity specific standard shall be permitted to be applied. And shall be permitted to be applied is NFPA speak for may. Okay, anytime you see that, that means may. We can't use may because it's not enforceable, so we say shall be permitted. And if the 61, if the commodity-specific standard prohibits a requirement, the prohibition applies. Okay, if the commodity-specific standard is silent, then the requirement in 652 applies. And the example I use for this is, say 652 says that you need to paint your dust collector. It doesn't say you need to paint your dust collector, but who knows, maybe in a couple more cycles it will. But if it does, and if you're an agricultural dust facility and and 61 says you have to paint your dust collector pink, then you have to paint your dust collector pink. If 654 says, if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer and 654 says you are prohibited from painting your dust collector, then you can't paint your dust collector. If you're a woodworking facility and 664 says nothing, then you can paint your dust collector. You have to paint it, but you can paint it any color you want. I've started to get questions on the conflicts, and where the conflict provisions will play itself out is when we talk about dust hazard analysis in a few minutes. Okay. There's a general statement on retroactivity in all NFPA documents, and basically what it says is that if you need to build your facility according to the version of the standard that was in effect at the time you built it. We don't expect people to rebuild. NFPA does not expect people to change things, to rebuild a facility to meet a newer version of the standard. Your authority having jurisdiction may do that. Your insurance company may want you to do that. Whose insurance company is an example of an authority having jurisdiction. Unless the technical committee and the document specifically has decided that certain things need to be retroactive, and I'll go through what's retroactive and what not. Typically those are management systems elements, safety procedures, operating procedures that are retroactive in a standard. Again, if something's required, if you built your facility to something that, 2000, in the 90s, you're not required to build it up, bring it up to the most recent code. This is the definition of a dust hazard analysis in 652. So it's a systematic review to identify and evaluate the potential fire, flash fire, or explosion hazards associated with the presence of one or more combustible particulate solids in a process or facility. And we talk about combustible particulate solid because they're bigger pieces of material that can form dust, and dust hazard analysis should take into account the fact that the bigger pieces of material break down and form dust. Okay. Chapter 4, general, and 652 has information on what the owner-operator is responsible for, determining the hazards of the dust, identifying and assessing hazards, managing hazards, and communicating hazards to employees. Okay. There's a chapter on testing. There's a lot of annex material here. Again, this is where all the information on dust, representative dust properties is in the annex for Chapter 5. And this is really the first time that testing requirements and sampling requirements have been pulled together in a dust document in one place. What the standard says, and what 61 says as well, is that you are allowed to use historical data or facility data. You just need to make sure that that data is representative of your material. So it's up to you to, if you're using historical data you have, data in a table, it's your responsibility to make sure that that's right. There's information in Chapter 5 on sampling plan, how to handle mixtures, how to get a representative sample. Okay. Chapter 7 of NFPA 652 is requirements to perform a dust hazard analysis, and this is a new requirement in 652. This is where we had several challenges to the document at annual meeting. This is what the challenges were about. We're about dust hazard analysis, and this is meant to be applied retroactively. Requirements for dust hazard analysis have been in 654 and 664 for about 10 years, but they weren't retroactive. They are retroactive now in both those documents through the last revision cycle. 61, when I get to 61, we'll go through the dust hazard analysis provisions in 61. This is the first time in the 2017 edition there's been a requirement for an agricultural dust facility to do a dust hazard analysis. So 652, it's meant to be applied retroactively. So if you have a new facility or you make a modification to your facility that's subject to 652, you need to do your dust hazard analysis as part of that project. If you're not making any changes, under 652 you have 3 years to do your dust hazard analysis from the effective date. And the effective date of the standard was just about almost a year ago now. I can tell you it's 5 years in 61, and it's only for specific equipment, so that when I get to that slide. And there is a statement in there that the 3-year deadline or the 5-year deadline or any deadline is meant so not to wait till 2 years, 9 months, 11 months, and 15 days. And it's like doing your homework at the last minute, and it won't work. Trust me. Chapter 8 has all of the specific hazard management, building design, equipment design, housekeeping provisions. One of the things that the 652 committee is going to be looking at next week at the meeting is fleshing out some more of these requirements in 652. They'll probably come from 654, but it's one of the agenda items for the meeting next week. Okay. Chapter 9 is management systems requirements, and the management system requirements are all retroactive. The whole chapter is retroactive. Things like operating procedures, training, contractor safety, emergency planning and response, management of change, document retention. Okay. 61. I got about 8 minutes here, but that's okay. This standard dates back to 1923. It used to be A, B, C. There were several. They were pulled together probably about 10, 15 years ago, if not longer. So again, I have 10 minutes left. What 61 applies to is agricultural facilities, facilities that handle starch, and seed preparation and meal handling systems that are not covered by NFPA 36. 36 actually has its own piece on dust. And again, this is what I'm talking about here is the 2017 edition of NFPA 61 that was just issued in the last couple months. So this is the new edition. And 61 is the only document that reorganized according to the direction of the Correlating Committee. So I always put in a plug for the committee. The committee did a lot of work the last revision cycle, and they really did a substantial overhaul. Well, not overhaul. They did more work than the other committees, and I always give them credit for that when I talk to the Correlating Committee. So this is the outline. So the outline looks a lot like 652. And one of the reasons for that, they're not just doing that, the Correlating Committee is not just doing that to make the editors and everybody's lives miserable, but if you look at the conflict provisions, what it's meant to do is that if you have a requirement in 652 that section 8.x.y, you can eventually go to 61 and look at the same, it'll be the same topic. And then you can make a comparison and know which one you need to follow based on the conflicts. So again, it looks like the same. The table of contents is identical to 652. What the committee did this past cycle through is a lot of work to correlate the definitions. So the definitions are the same throughout, are moving to be the same throughout all of the dust documents. Added material on what the owner-operator was responsible for, worked on updating the objectives of the document to align with the other dust documents. So the Correlating Committee, a task group recommended that all the dust documents have these set of objectives, and every single committee tweaked it a little bit. So, and performance-based design is now an alternative. So Chapter 6 is performance-based design in NFPA 61, and that's an alternate, that's an option for the first time in NFPA in 61. Okay. Chapter 5 has material on hazard identification. And again, it's up to the owner-operator to determine if your dust is combustible or explosible, and you need to characterize your dust so that you can perform a dust hazard analysis. And also, a lot of the testing you need to do it so that you can design your explosion protection equipment. And again, I talked about the annex material, additional annex material. That table has been revised extensively. Okay. Dust hazard analysis in Chapter 7, so it's the same chapter, so you can look at the two chapters. The requirements apply retroactively. For new processes and those undergoing significant modifications, you need to do a DHA as part of the process. 61 defines a significant modification as something that exceeds 25% of the replacement cost of the system. So that's a little different than some of the other standards. I think next time through, the other standards will adopt this definition because the Correlating Committee is basically directing them to. If you are an ag dust facility, you're subject to NFPA 61, you need to do, only need to do a dust hazard analysis on certain pieces of equipment. Bucket elevators, conveying, grinding equipment, spray dryer systems, and dust collection systems, and you have 5 years to perform that from the date of effectiveness or the date of adoption of NFPA 61. And I think the actual date is June that it became effective. I'd have to look again at the first page of that to get the actual date that it was issued. The requirement is to evaluate hazards and provide recommendations to manage the hazards. It's required to be performed by a qualified person and be documented. So there's a couple examples. We don't tell you how to do your dust hazard analysis. There's a lot of different techniques that can be used. It's not meant to be a PHA under OSHA 1910-119. We made that as clear as we could throughout 652, throughout all the dust documents. There's an example in Annex B of 652 for a new process, and there's a checklist that can be used as an example. We're not saying that you need to use it. We're just saying that this is one way you can do a dust hazard analysis that the committee added in Annex E of 61. Chapter 8 is where most of the standard went. Most of the material that was in all the rest of 61 was reorganized and put into Chapter 8. Okay, and Chapter 9 is the management system elements. And the management system elements, Chapter 9 is meant to be retroactive. There's a statement right at the beginning of it. So it applies to all facilities. And this is the outline of what's in there. There's a couple other things than 652. There were things that needed to be brought in and needed a home. Things like storage of oils, flammable liquids, warning signs, miscellaneous storage are all part of Chapter 9. Okay. The next steps, people ask us all the time if we're going to have one document, one dust document someday. And I think that's really up to the technical committees. I know that each committee has their own objectives, their own personality. I know that 61 wants to be a standalone document that you don't need to use 652 with it. From my experience, just trying to get all the committees to look at the objectives and having them all do it differently, I can say that it probably won't happen in my career. But I think it depends on what the committees want. It depends on what the users want. I think the documents will be more and more like each other, create less confusion within the industries, not just the agricultural industry, but everywhere about, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to use? This says one thing, this says the other. Combustible dust is defined differently. So you'll see the process, the Correlating Committee is starting to take effect, and things are starting to look a lot more like each other, at least be organized like each other. And again, the finished second draft, everything's going right back into cycle again.